Namaskar. My name is Vivek Iyer, and the reason that I'm making this video is so as to tell you a little bit about the latest book that I have written. So the name of the book is Argumentative Indian Imbeciles. It's available in paperback or in the Kindle edition from Amazon. So if you take a look at the cover, what we see Pandit Nehru, the Prime Minister, and what he has in his hand is a bolster, a pillow, and he's prepared to chuck it at somebody else at a Congress conference of the Indian National Congress, the main political party at that time. And somebody had fallen asleep, so he was chucking a pillow at them to wake them up. And this was the Congress session at which Congress committed itself to a socialist pattern of society for independent India. And there were plenty of arguments, but they were imbecilic arguments. People fell asleep, and that's why Pandit Nehru, the Prime Minister, had to chuck pillows at people. Now, the central argument in this book really it concentrates on some philosophers and public intellectuals who, even 10 years ago, 12 years ago, they were household names. They were people who were greatly respected. And or some of them were those who published a lot in the Indian newspapers, or they gave a lot of interviews. They were well known. One or two I don't think were very well known, like Akil Bilgrami. But I focus on Akil Bilgrami because he is a proper philosopher. He has a proper training in analytical philosophy. But that actually makes it more instructive to look at the type of arguments that he produces. And they are just the same sort of arguments. I mean, he's on the same side as Amartya Sen and Pratap Mehta and so on and so forth. Maybe 10 years ago that was fine. But now these people appear shrill, they appear hysterical, they appear completely out of touch with reality. And by looking at the some of the philosophical theories behind this type of stupidity, we are able to see that what we have in the case of the argumentative Indian is that people are picking up a metaphysical argument in their own tradition. For example, in Bilgrami's tradition, there was the debate on imkan ikism, can God tell a lie? With the so-called reformers like Sirhindi, Waliullah on one side, and the more orthodox people on the other side. And this is the Barelvi, Deobandi, and these things persist, and they become quite envenomed, and it's really not very productive at all. But you see, at the back of these sort of debates or these arguments was nothing of any great substance. These were theological debates. They were point scoring. One person is saying that I belong to the true Muhammadiyah line, and the rest of you don't. So you may say exactly the same thing as I say, but my semantic intention is superior because I'm. In fact, this was the argument used by Khwaja Mir Dard, who belonged to a lineage, a Muhammadiyah lineage. These are really silly arguments, and they're based on, you see, back at that time, these arguments could be resolved very simply by saying, okay, now you perform a miracle. It's like if Tansen has to prove that he's a superior musician, then you sing Dear Pajala, and if the candle bursts into flame, yeah, then you are the greatest star because you're performing a miracle by singing Dear Pajala. Deep actually jal jati hai. So you see, you had these arguments which are of metaphysical type, but they were resolved through supernatural occurrences. And it is crazy to say that India had a tradition of public argument, and that argument is very important, and that when people have a public debate, then society is able to see both sides of the picture. And so democracy and democratic decision making and all this type of thing, that is silly. But that was the argument made in 2005 in a very influential book written by Amartya Sen called The Argumentative Indian. And you see, at that time, what had happened was that Manmohan Singh had become prime minister, and he had launched MNREGA. Basically he was creating what's called iron rice bowl for the rural poor, that you'll get at least 100 days of work. So you don't have to move. You can stay there and rot, and you will have food. So, but you see, China only began to make progress when they smashed the iron rice bowl. So India, instead of learning that lesson 15 years later, is going the opposite direction. And so it was quite useful. And, of course, economists will point that out. Just recently, Paul Krugman pointed out to the students at Ashoka, in a Zoom or whatever, that sort of meeting. He said, look, guys, you can't come up unless you screw over labor somewhat. Basically, you get rich by working harder for less. And, and you have to do that. Even in studies, if you want to do your MBA or your CA or something, you have to work much harder for 2, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and then you're on a higher plane. It's true of countries. It's true of everybody. But creating this iron rice bowl, obviously, it was populist. It would have electoral dividends, which it did. Manmohan was re-elected, and in this interim, the hope was, the theory was that look, we're going to get plenty of FDI, foreign direct investment. But you see, foreign direct investment means foreign direct influence. Nobody puts their money in without demanding power and influence. So the question is, how will that power and influence be exercised? So it was very much in Sonia Gandhi's interest and for Manmohan Singh's interest and so forth to create something like National Advisory Council. To say, well, this is not the old planning commission, which is packed full of crazy leftists and bureaucrats and nonsense people. And it's completely corrupt. It's agency captured. It's useless. So this is something different. This is a National Advisory Council. And, you had Anu Agarwal. She's a proper entrepreneur. She's a wonderful personality. So you had some bright spots. And more generally, the idea was that Sonia Gandhi ji, she didn't go to university. So she actually respects professors. People who went to university, they know that professors are useless. And she reads, she likes reading, and she's a very nice, thoughtful person. And people like Obama, they're impressed with her because they saw, which is very, very sensible, well-read, and straightforward. But Rahul, unfortunately, perhaps because he had an MPhil from Cambridge and he'd studied at Harvard, Rahul comes across as a moon calf. And but Amartya Sen back then in 2005, people still thought he was smart because they hadn't read what he'd written. Now, when I actually read everything that he wrote, every single paper, I produced this book, Amartya Sen and Myotics Sociopathology, which says sounds very bombastic. But in fact, Myotics, you see, Myotics is what Socrates pioneered. The art where you are talking and arguing to the purpose in the same way that a midwife helps a person to give birth, a woman to give birth. So the idea is that this type of argument it's not just for the sake of argument. It's not to win, not to lose. It is to give birth to something which is viable. So an idea is like a baby, which can grow up, which can thrive, which can change its environment. But you see, the problem was that if you look at Amartya Sen's arguments, they're all extremely sterile. They start off from an idealized position, which cannot be implemented in the world ever, because it's an arrow to brew world without Nightingale uncertainty. But in such a world, there'd be no language. You don't need language if there's no uncertainty. There'd be no evolution. There'd be no language. There'd be some robots, but even they would. There is a Razborov, Rudich. There's a theorem which says that you can't distinguish pseudo-random from random strings. We believe that's true, and if it is true, then even if there is no uncertainty, even if we live in a arrow de completely predictable, deterministic world, populated by AIs with perfect rationality, even then, you would still have concurrency problems, Dijkstra and so on. So these are technical matters. And in this book, Amartya Sen and Myotic Social Proctology, I go through every single thing that Amartya Sen ever wrote and showed that it was nonsense. And he must have known that he was lying, but he just went ahead and did it anyway. It's a reckless disregard for the truth. And arguments based on lies are, in logic, there's something called the principle of explosion. That if you say something false, then any nonsense at all can be deduced from that false statement. So if you say cats or dogs, then from this you can deduce anything. You can deduce that, I am Beyonce. That's how logic works. Anyway, so let me return to the current book, Argumentative Imbeciles. And you see, as I say, 10 years ago, India was under Manmohan Singh, it was bluffing. It was playing a game of bluff. It was saying, no, no, look, we are creating right to information, right to education, right to this, rights. Is a rights-based approach to development. In fact, we have achieved subsidiarity because through people can claim their rights, and thus decision-making will go down towards the village level and to the district level. And in fact, this was Rahul's pitch. He was saying that, look, I don't have to be prime minister because no, prime minister's job is unimportant. It's ornamental. Because the poor woman in Juggi mein jo baith rahi hai, she has got right to information, right to education, right to food. So she can exercise these rights, gain all the powers that she needs to change her life. So it was in this context that he was saying that, the poor woman who doesn't have a boat, no, she is the wave. She is the boat and she is the wave. And I don't need to shave and I don't need to become prime minister, which was a good thing because, first daddy was blown up. I'm sorry, first granny was blown up, then daddy is blown up. And each time Congress party gets a lot of votes and Rahul Baba is saying, anybody, somebody else can be prime minister, doesn't matter. Eh? अरे भाई किसी दूसरा को बिठाओ. So I mean, but it was rational for Rahul to stay away from this nonsense. What was not rational was for the Indian public, intellectuals and activists, to pretend that Narendra Modi is a fascist and that there's Nazism and, just simply to write uh, more and more crazy nonsense. And you see, the fact is that Modi, he he showed that at the same time that the communists in Bengal, when the farmers protested against, in Singur, farmers protested against land being taken for factories. If the CPM had, left front had said, okay, fine, we back down, they'd still be in power. But they didn't. They were obstinate. Whereas, firstly, Modi had realized that you can't bow down too much to capitalists, to industrialists. You have to, play hardball. But, on one occasion where farmers objected, I mean, they changed their mind, basically. They had agreed and they said, they did the maths again. They said, no. So immediately cancelled it. That was it. And now we see with the farm law, which hadn't been implemented. So basically, there was an agitation against what might happen. We don't know what would happen, but anyway, now he's back down. And that's good enough. Things like CA didn't change anything. It's a completely useless law. But it looked as though he was doing something that was good enough. And that increased, it enabled BJP to open, to gain a large number of seats in Bengal, to open their account there, because previously there was zero. Uh, And RSS, I had warned a couple of years ago that you see, RSS, they want West Bengal so much because it is the intellectual capital of Hindutva. That's where the word Hindutva comes from, West Bengal. Savarkar took it up, that it was created in Bengal, Swami Vivekananda and so forth. And they would gladly sacrifice Shah and Modi to get a foothold in West Bengal. And that's why Shah and Modi, they expose themselves. Who would go and fight with Mamta on her home turf? Nobody, not nobody in their right mind. She was, her foot was in a plaster. She was literally in a wheelchair and she beat the hell out of them. But in the process, of course, who gets really destroyed? It's not the chap who puts up a good fight. It's the Congress and the left who couldn't even do that. They're now down to zero. So, and the public intellectuals, they've been talking worthless nonsense, and they've completely lost any contact with reality. You have Pratap Banu Mehta, who resigned from Ashoka, and everyone said, oh my God, this is fascism, Hitler. But Ashoka is a private university. Anu Agarwal, she's one of the founders. And of course, if he was doing his job, which is to take a stick and beat Modi and Shah for not putting through the reforms, that's what the capitalists want. The industrialists want the reforms. They're not getting it. So you should be hitting Modi saying that you ignorant fellow, you don't know economics, you don't know mechanism design, why you not Nirmala Sitharaman, attack her by all means, slash at her. She has only got an MPhil or something from JNU. All these guys have got the PhDs from MIT and Harvard and Princeton. So go after hit them on economics. But don't tell lies that they're going to deport all the Muslims. Say Shaheen Bagh, complete fiasco. Because you have a bunch of elderly Muslim ladies and they're saying, yeah, we don't want to be deported, but nobody's going to deport them. So what they're really protesting against is that Hindus who fled and Sikhs who fled, that they should not get citizenship. But they will get citizenship, since that was decided back in 48. In fact, in 48, the Constituent Assembly introduced the permit system, which openly discriminated against Muslims. Nehru, Ambedkar, they said to the assembly that, look, the people that we're getting are Hindus and Sikhs. If there are any Muslims who want to return, they can only return provided their property hasn't been reallocated and the district commissioner certifies that, yeah, they can come back. They have to jump through hoops. And so, you see, the early months of 1948, about 20,000 people had returned from Lahore to New Delhi. And this was right. So, the people in the Constituent Assembly, they could see these guys are coming back. So immediately they enacted these measures. And of course, the Indian Constitution has adopted the doctrine of autochthony, which means that any law or regulation which was existing at the time, it is deemed to be immemorial law of the land. So the harmonious construction of Indian Constitution allows us to say that its basic structure has a fundamental asymmetry with respect only to Muslims, nobody else, because only Muslims on the basis of religion were firstly deprived of affirmative action. Under from 1937 onwards, Dalit Muslims did have some affirmative action, but that went zero. They got zero after that. I'm not talking about reserved seats for the community as a whole. I'm just saying that the very notion that there is a Dalit community within Islam which deserves, that was out. And of course, the other thing was citizenship. And don't forget that custodian of evacuee property, would be constantly harassing the Muslims who had never crossed the border. They've been sitting there. Some of them were Congresswalas. They were related to ministers, but they're being harassed. Why? Because some guy says, in Karachi, I owned a cinema hall. I've been checked out. Now this guy owns a cinema hall. But his brother went to Pakistan. So I want half of the cinema hall which belonged to the brother, give that to me. And of course, if he gets half the thing, he and his relatives, they're going to make their life so miserable that you'll want to sell up and leave. And in East Pakistan, the Hindus who left, it was not through the direct government action, it was through harassment. And there was this harassment in India in the 50s and 60s, and nothing can be done about it. So this fundamental asymmetry was there. And more particularly, I've said elsewhere in these books, and there's another book that I have, another very thick book. So this is Acribia, Economia, and Antidosis. So again, this is looking at uh, how people reason, public justification theory, and economic analyses and political science analyses. And we find three things. The first thing we find is that people are using the wrong type of logic. So they're using, what's called Hilbert logic, which is a series of tautologies, whereas they should be using Gentzen sequent calculi, which are conditional tautologies. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious when you say it. And this thing has been around since the 1930s. Gentzen was a Nazi. He really was a Nazi. But these things have been there for a long time. The second thing is that, in game theory, especially in evolutionary game theory, from the time of John Maynard Smith going back to 1960s, 1970s, you had the notion of an uncorrelated asymmetry. So these are things like the fact that I'm a boy, not a girl, that I have this equipment, not that equipment. So that's an uncorrelated asymmetry. And where you have uncorrelated asymmetries, including things like who owns what, who wrote what, I wrote this. So you can have an argument about it, but it's an argument about an uncorrelated asymmetry. And for any practical purpose, that argument must be buck stopped. There must be a protocol bound way of deciding it one way or the other. So that a bourgeois strategy, in fact, this is the actual name of the winning of the strategy to solve hawk dove and other conflicts. It's a bourgeois strategy. That the guy who actually owns it, or the guy with that uncorrelated asymmetry, he and only he should implement that strategy, and that is eusocial. So all these guys, I mean, they read this. I mean, it's been around since I was in college, which was in 79, 80, long time ago. They know it, but they just ignore it. So you've got no game theory. So, I mean, and there are people like idiot Kaushik Basu, biggest imbecile, and he is doing something as stupid as double counting. In accountants, this is like when you're 16, fallacies, double counting fallacies are explained to you. Or in accountancy, it's basic. That's why you have double entry bookkeeping. It's to prevent double counting, and so complete nonsense. So as I said, you have firstly that you're not using sequent calculi, you're not using category theory or directed graphs. You're using medieval logic for no good reason. Even though you study these things at Ivy League, shame on you. You are completely ignoring uncorrelated asymmetry, the very concept. And there's Robert Oman, Nobel laureate. And when Robert Oman, when he looks at his own Talmud, his own Jewish, uh, he sees the game theory in Talmud. Now in India, you actually have Mahabharata, where there is an Alopicanum, where it actually says that for the just king to dispel his rishad, his mental depression, he actually has to learn what? Statistical game theory. This is what Nalopicanum says. That's how Yudhishthira's rishad is dispelled. And all these so-called game theorists, they'll write nonsense about the Gita, republish the same nonsense again. Amartya same, complete nonsense. Even though this is what it clearly says, there is duality in the Mahabharata. You can say adjoint functors. You can use category theory. And by the way, that can be given a Hegelian. William Lawyer is given it Hegelian interpretation. So you can be a leftist. Lawyer was a leftist. He's still around, I think. So even the left could have embraced it. And don't forget, you see, the reason that back in 50s or 60s, left was respected because a smarter chap was a leftist. So people would say at least their English is good, at least their maths is good. Maybe crazy, but they work hard. Now all that's gone. Now you just have Gayatri Spivak type worthless, just vomit, just craziness, illiteracy. And then, of course, the other thing is that everybody will go on writing books about Mahatma Gandhi, and then they will try to show that Ambedkar was a complete cretin, that he was a fool. Whereas the fact is that Ambedkar was a pragmatist. He actually studied, he got two PhDs, one in fiscal policy, one in monetary policy. He studied under Dewey. He's a pragmatist. He knows the CSPS tradition. So this man is a philosopher, this man is a sociologist, this man is an economist, this man is a barrister who knew constitutional law. That's why they put him in, to draft constitution. This man wasn't. He went, he did high school matriculation, and then he ate some dinner, and he got barrister's certificate after passing, vomiting up what he had memorized. Nice man. Both were very nice men, but people with PhDs will write nonsense about this man while pretending this guy was a genius. And that's really rather unfair. I think it shows some type of bias which I can't understand. I simply can't understand it. So these are, so going back to argumentative Indian imbeciles, let me take the most imbecilic argument that happened in the last few years. And that was where the Benares Hindu University, it has a special department to train Hindu priests. And they went and appointed a Muslim to teach Hindu priestcraft. And the student said, look, this guy he's not a Hindu. He doesn't know Hindu priestcraft. He can't teach us this. They said, no, you're objecting because he's a Muslim. But the objection is that because he's a Muslim, if he actually does practice Hindu priestcraft, then he is liable to be ostracized by his own community because it is against Islamic law. You can perform any type of murti puja, any type of idolatrous action. But if you don't perform that, then you can't discharge your function as a teacher of Hindu priestcraft because you have to show exactly how to do it and you actually have to do it. So this complete craziness where they say, no, to be secular, you have to help Muslim to teach you Hindu priestcraft, which is mad. So this is the level of imbecility that was attained in India. And going forward, I think, the ordinary people now understand that we have to catch up with Bangladesh. That in Bangladesh, they rose up because they took the rural girls from the rural area and put them into the factories, big factories. That's it. There is the other route, which is to take the girl from wherever and give her JNU MPhil in this nonsense or that nonsense. Is useless. So, enough with the imbecility. There is no alternative to hard work. And ultimately, you see, when a man publishes so many books, and there's another three over there, and I published them all this year. So my point is that anybody can write books and pretend to be smart and, and to take down the pants of all the professors. Anybody can do it. It's easy. You just take each sentence, look it up on the Wikipedia, say, okay, factually, he's incorrect. He's told this lie, and also he's stupid. So he's a liar. Proof from Wikipedia immediately. This lie, and he's stupid because logic. You could read a quick article on logic and say he has committed this particular logical fallacy, this particular logical fallacy. So taking any of these Indian or other public intellectuals, you can take them line by line and easily create a book this thick, or you know, all this is just in 1 year. You can generate these books and publish them for free. Just publish it on Amazon Kindle. So anybody can do it. This is not hard work, you know. But this is what Harvard education has reduced his worthless nutters to. They're stupid liars and their publications are useless. So stick with hard work and say goodbye to these false pundits. Pandit ji, jao bhai. And Jai Hind.